So let's talk about the different models of maybe the history of public relations from press agentry and publicity all the way up to kind of the current model for what public relations should be. To begin with, there's a little bit of a degree to which one thing that'll be talked about in some later chapters, one thing that maybe is just worth noting here, is to a large degree, public relations is perhaps the creation that once you have larger organizations, that you have to begin to have a function of public relations, that becomes something in and of itself. And one of the things to keep in mind is marketing, advertising, all this didn't really exist. And this is kind of maybe a little bit more marketing public and advertising, but they really didn't exist until the advent of, functions for advertising like newspapers and magazines, but they also came about with the Industrial Revolution. With the Industrial Revolution, there was the opportunity for companies to mass produce things like flour and like sugar, so you could, instead of doing it, before, if you were living here in Central Illinois and you probably had maybe some farmland and you farmed, and then you would mill your flour. Maybe you would take it to a mill that would mill it for you, and then you'd take home the flour, you'd scrape it back into a bucket or whatever you took it in, and you would go home and you would have flour. Well, then eventually industrialization comes along, and they need people to go work in factories, and they need people who aren't growing their own wheat and grinding their own flour, so the companies emerge to sell flour. Well, that's all good. But initially, you could just go maybe buy just flour. But then people go, well, I sell flour. My company is Pillsbury or whatever, and I sell flour, and I want the Pillsbury to sell more flour than the other companies that make flour. And so I'm going to somehow differentiate it. And so what they began to do is they began to advertise. They began to say, Pillsbury flour is great. And so that became kind of the creation of advertising and the creation of the need for branding and marketing and public relations, because now you had to differentiate yourself in the marketplace and to build brand loyalty among your clientele or among the public. Now, all of that to say that's all nice and fun and good, but the case is that's kind of, it's sort of the same time you begin to kind of see the emergence of public relations. And so, you know what, I like just having the little whiteboard. So I'll just share my whiteboard again, not because it's necessarily, it just seems more interesting than watching me stand up here and talk. So I did not erase it last time. But the case here is we have this, kind of idea here, is the first one that comes along is what we call press agentry or publicity. And this is kind of the first model. It's kind of the earliest model. And this is kind of focused on like the P.T. Barnum kind of model. P.T. Barnum was the creator of the circus, Barnum and Bailey's circus. And the idea there is, you'd have a guy standing outside and he'd go on a big table, he'd stand up on a platform or a chair, some sort of thing, stand up here with, maybe a big stick, and wave it around and get people's attention and say, you need to buy this. And all the people down here would be listening going, wow, that's absolutely amazing. I definitely need to buy that. And the fact is it may be true, it may not be true, but essentially it's a company or organization basically just handing things down to the people. There's no real concern for the people. You're trying to sell a product, whether it works or not. This is the elixir, perhaps the idea there, you're selling flour and other things, but maybe it's like, hey, I have an elixir here that will solve all your problems with antacid and other things. And people would be like, I'll buy this elixir, and they leave, and then they come back, and the next day they're unhappy. And this guy has gone on over to the next town, and he is over there shilling it. And it doesn't matter that all these people over here are unhappy because he doesn't have to see them anymore. And that's kind of the early model of what public relations was. It's kind of creating it and trying to hand it out to them. There's little concern for the marketplace. There's little concern for what they want or need. It's just kind of trying to draw attention. One of the ones they use in the book is an example also of IHOP, that becoming IHOB. That was a big deal a few years ago. They decided they were going to become the International House of Burgers, and they were going to rename themselves. They got all this attention. People are like, what is IHOB going to be? And then they finally revealed that it's burgers, after a lot of people thought it was bacon. And that was kind of their thing. And everybody's kind of like, burgers? Like, really? IHOP burgers? They didn't get it. Now, I personally, I've eaten at IHOP probably more than I should admit. But I actually kind of like IHOP, and I actually think their burgers are pretty good. As a matter of fact, I wouldn't say that I wouldn't go there for a burger, but if I'm going there, I definitely, a burger or an omelet or just pancakes would be one of the things I get, depending upon my mood. If I don't feel like an omelet or pancakes, I'm going for a burger. So it doesn't surprise me, but that's kind of an example of where, they're just kind of trying to create a bunch of publicity and look at us and yay, excitement. And there's no real concern for what the marketplace wants. It's just, we're going to give you burgers and we're handing it down to you. All right. The next model, which comes about after that, is what we might call the public information model. This one comes about, it's somewhat attributed to the Parker and Ivy, George Parker and Ivy Lee. It's Parker and Lee, I guess. They formed an early public relations format together. Both of them came from journalism. They both were reporters, AP, New York Times, New York Post, other places, and they eventually went out and started doing PR. In this case, it's very much the same, but instead of the company giving kind of the information down without regard, they begin to give the information across to you. So here's the public, and here's the organization. And they begin to kind of just say, we know what you want, we know what you need, and we're going to give you that information. We're going to be very matter of fact, we're going to be very truthful, we're going to be very factual, but we're going to give you what you need, and we're going to come at it from a very kind of detached journalistic standpoint of, we're not trying to hoodwink you, we're not trying to fool you or anything, we're just going to give you the information. So basically the idea is that both of them began to work for the railroads, and one of the things that became big was Ivy Lee. There was the railroad accent, and typically in the past the railroad industry was very secretive. As a matter of fact, anybody who has worked in the media has ever had to deal with railroads. Even today, the railroad industry can be fairly secretive. The place where these railroad tracks lands, the actual area where the railroad tracks are, is owned by the railroad. And so, for example, you may see a railroad track, next to a road or along a field, but the railroad itself is owned by the railroad. They own that property. And so if you walk onto that property, you're actually trespassing, and you can be arrested and charged with trespassing. And so it's not unusual when there's a train accident that sometimes it happens down along like a river, and there's a bridge over it. In order to get to it, to see it, they have to go along the railroad track to get to it. And if you're a reporter, it's not unusual for them to be like, hey, you're on our property, get off. You're trespassing. And so it's always been the case that, the railroad to a large degree doesn't want people to know about accidents and other things, and can be a little bit secretive. I covered one railroad accident, and they were kind of secretive. It wasn't even their fault. It was just kind of one of those, like, they didn't want to be messed with. They didn't want to mess with the media, and they weren't exactly polite. It was definitely not their fault. A guy driving a semi drove in front of a train that was moving about 8 miles per hour. Train tried to stop, and it didn't. It stopped about 20 feet after it went through the truck. And the truck wrapped around the front. Actually, it was more like about 75, 80 feet after it wrapped around the truck. And it made for quite a sight. Nobody was hurt, but they weren't very responsive. So the railroad industry has always been known for being rather secretive. But what Ivy Lee did was, he basically came in and he said, you know what? We're going to do this differently. We're going to set up tents. We're going to give the reporters place to do. We're going to hand them all the information. We're going to walk them along our railroad tracks and let them see and take pictures of the whole event. That's the camera. It doesn't look like it. And give them a chance to do it. And so it's very much, we're going to give them what they need. Now, the only difference is it's very one way. They realize that us being honest and helpful is going to garner good press. And so we'll give them what we think they need. So it's sort of very focused on giving them, but it's definitely a lot more helpful. Then along comes what the next model of it is, which is the two-way asymmetrical model. Asymmetrical, you all know that symmetry is basically where you have something and it looks the same on both sides, right? And that's my same. That's, you know, it's symmetrical. It's the same on both sides. So an asymmetrical relationship is one in which one person, you know, maybe this guy has lots of money and then over here this guy has very little money, just pennies, right? And so this is kind of an asymmetrical balance of power for money. They don't have the same thing. But if you have two guys who both have $1 million, right? Those two have a symmetrical balance of power. So they have similar power, similar structure, similar other things. Well, the two-way asymmetrical communication is one in which basically you have a company or organization, and what it does is it, you know, kind of goes out, it talks to the public, it listens. This is supposed to be an ear, I don't know. It's listening to the public and it hears what they have to say, and then it tailors its message back to them and it kind of listens, but it's all very much in the interest of the company. The company is the one who is doing the communication, who's listening purely to find out what the public thinks in order to serve it better. And so there's sort of some good examples. One is the Torches of Freedom campaign. It's kind of a fun one where during the early days of cigarette, they got a contract to sell cigarettes. They thought, how can we sell more cigarettes? They said, well, women are a huge market. What if we could get women to buy more cigarettes? But women largely smoke in their houses and nobody sees women smoking. And so women don't always get a very solid sales pitch for buying cigarettes. So they went out and they did some market research. They said, how can we find out what women want, what they would want to be smokers? And they realized that a lot of women smoke because smoking is sort of a symbol of freedom. I can do what I want. I don't have to listen to anybody. It also, there may be from kind of a Freudian perspective that there's something that oral satisfaction, that's, you know, a sexual satisfaction from having a cigarette in one's mouth, things like that. Now, that's kind of from a Freudian perspective, which would have been popular back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. So what they did was one year is they decided that they would send out telegrams to prominent women who were society debutantes, women who had kind of what would be social media influencers of the day, debutantes in high society. And they invited them to help stand up to provide for women's rights and to fight for the symbol of women. And they asked them to stroll up and down Fifth Avenue in New York City, smoking cigarettes on Easter Day. And they did, and they called them Torches of Freedom, and women were going to be empowered, and women went out and they got the newspapers to cover it, and they created this whole sensation. So what they did was they did listen to the public. They found what the public likes about cigarettes and how they want it, and then they tailored their message to give it back to them. It's very asymmetrical. It's not asking what's good for the customer. It's not asking what the customer really wants. It's not asking what the best way to do it is. But it is listening to the public. And that's a little bit different than the public information, which is straightforward and honest, but doesn't really concern itself with listening to what the public wants. And then finally, you get what's called the two-way symmetrical model. And the symmetrical model is the idea that even if the public, you have a corporation or organization, it may be this huge thing, but it says each individual person over here who is maybe going to buy the product and do this type of thing, it views them on the little teeter-totter as having, equal weight to the company and having equal importance. And so it's going to listen. It's going to say, well, if they want this, then that's what we'll give them. And the examples here might be, they do research to find out what do people want in cars, and it looks for the positives and the negatives, and it gives them that. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that companies or corporations, there's an ethical dynamic to this, in that, if that campaign, the Torches of Freedom, had been selling something other than smoking, it would have had a different impact on that as a view as being symmetrical versus asymmetrical. Part of what makes it symmetrical is the fact that it serves the public equally as it serves the organization. It gets a win-win. It doesn't just get people smoking so you make more money. That is a win-lose, right? Yes, I get a sense of freedom. I think I'm winning, but I'm really losing because I'm picking up a habit that is very bad for me. And so that's kind of where we can take that to be. All right. If anybody has any, I'm going to stop this. I'm going to come back and just make a couple more comments in a separate video, just because I don't want to make this too long.